Did you know that the word course in English dates back to the 1300s? Originally, it was used to talk about like the paths of the moon and the planets, or it was used to talk about like races and running, like the course he took. And we still use the word course in this sense. We talk about like blood coursing through our veins, or we talk about planes flying off course. I think it's helpful to keep this in mind when we're thinking about a university course, because course implies movement or motion. You start in one place and then you end up somewhere else. So when I'm selecting books for a course reading list, this is what I've got to figure out. Where do we want to go and how are we going to get there? So a number of people have asked me for a reading list. They asked like, what's on your course syllabus? What books are you teaching this semester? So I thought I'd make a video about that. If you're new here, my name's Dr. Moore. I'm a professor in the Great Books program at St. Thomas University. And in this video, I'll walk you through my reading list for my first year Great Books course. The first year course I'm teaching this semester is called Great Books 1006, Great Thinkers and Writers. It's an introduction to the study of great books. And it's also an opportunity for us, I think, to think about writing. What is the work that writers do in the world, and what effect does great writing have on the world and on us? To start the course off, we read a Greek tragedy. We read Sophocles' Antigone. I recommend this book a lot to people who are interested in reading great books and are looking for an entry point into classic literature. And it's partly because this play asks us so many important questions. Does loyalty to your family matter more than loyalty to your country? Are we as humans free to make choices, or are our choices governed by fate? What gives a law its legitimacy? What do we owe to the dead? The conflict in this play is between a young woman named Antigone and Creon, the leader of Thebes, and they are arguing about whether or not to bury a body. Antigone's deceased brother, Polynices, is a traitor to the state. Antigone wants her brother buried. Creon wants the body of the traitor to rot above ground as a message to other traitors. And they both believe they have the moral high ground, and at different points in the play, it seems like they both might be right. When we think about the movement of a course, I think Antigone is such a great book because it shows us how a work of literature can open up so many deep questions and expose us to alternative perspectives. Now, I like to pair Antigone with the work of a modern American essayist, James Baldwin, and specifically his essay, Notes of a Native Son. Baldwin is one of the great American essayists, and the thing I find most incredible about Notes of a Native Son is the way that Baldwin is able to take a personal tragedy. This essay is about the death of his father, and he connects that to a political tragedy. He uses it to reflect upon the history of racial discrimination in the United States. And then he connects that to a kind of existential problem, because the essay is also about how do we judge a human life. James Baldwin in this essay is grappling with very complicated feelings about his late father, who was kind of a petty, tyrannical, and in many ways cruel parent. At the same time, Baldwin is reflecting on his own experiences growing up as a black man in the United States in the 1940s and 1950s. And he comes to understand that the anger and the bitterness that his father felt were in many ways symptoms of the terrible conditions that he had to live with throughout his whole life. My students really seized on this semester that one of the things that this text does for us is it kind of modernizes the ancient Greek concept of fate. In Baldwin's account, fate is not some supernatural mystical force. Baldwin talks about intergenerational trauma and the way systemic injustice, the way that history and the historical crimes affect people in the present. So Baldwin illuminates for us these various ways that human life, our horizons, our possibilities might be kind of limited or at least shaped by things that happened before we were born. One of the things I think you want out of a Great Books course is just to be exposed to great writers. I think in part we learn to be better writers ourselves by being exposed to the best writers, watching and studying their technique, how they deploy images, how they structure paragraphs. This is where Audre Lorde fits in. In the Cancer Journals, Lorde talks about her experience with cancer, diagnosis, and treatment. And I think the thing that's really staying with me since we studied this book, we talked about it just last week in class actually, is the way that Lorde talks about her experience confronting fear. She talks about turning fear into a kind of companion, not particularly desirable, yet one whose knowledge can be useful. And she talks throughout this book about putting her fear to use and using her writing to turn her encounter with her own mortality into a kind of story, a narrative, a pattern that can be useful both for herself and for others. The book is really about how to think about and how to do meaningful work in the face of our own mortality, in the face of our human limitations. Living a self-conscious life under the pressure of time, I work with the consciousness of death at my shoulder, not constantly, but often enough to leave a mark upon all of my life's decisions and actions. And it does not matter whether this death comes next week or 30 years from now. This consciousness gives my life another breadth. It helps shape the words I speak, the ways I love, my politic of action, the strength of my vision and purpose, the depth of my appreciation of living. It's just badass. It's just badass. And then from the modern writers, we go back to the ancients. Plato's Alcibiades is a great dialogue about the nature of knowledge, and especially like political, ethical knowledge. Plato confronts for us a really fundamental question that follows from our study of Lord, which is like, okay, I'm going to live my life. I want to do meaningful work. I want to do good things. How do I know what to do? This dialogue is kind of about how to be a citizen. You know, we might think about politics and we think about issues or causes that we support. And we sometimes think, well, these are just matters of opinion. Some people think this, some people think that, some people support this, some people support that. But Plato's dialogues are typically these dramatized conversations between his teacher Socrates and some other person. So in this dialogue, Socrates is talking to this young guy Alcibiades who's ambitious, and he kind of thinks he knows everything. And Socrates identifies this as a problem because he makes the analogy to like medical doctors or music teachers. He says, look, if you wanted medical advice, or you wanted like musical training, lots of people have opinions about medicine. Lots of people have opinions about music. But if you wanted medical advice, would you just ask some rando, or would you see a doctor? If you wanted to learn how to play piano, would you come to me, or would you go to a piano teacher? Don't come to me. So on these matters, you want the advice of someone who has real knowledge, who knows about things. You want the advice of the expert. And Socrates says the same is true of politics. When we choose leaders, when we seek political advice, we ought to be seeking out the advice of people who really know something. And as citizens, we ought to educate ourselves so that we can take effective action, so that, we need to cultivate political knowledge, not just political opinions. So the movement of the course, when we start to put these various texts together, what we start to see, what starts to emerge is this broad conversation about how to act as a human being, like as mortal beings doomed to die. How are we supposed to navigate the world? What are we supposed to do? How do we act in meaningful ways? What does it mean to live well and do good? And in this course, we have a particular emphasis on how thinking and writing might themselves be ways of acting meaningfully, intervening in the world. Last writer I'm going to talk about, I'm going to close out the term this year with Alice Munro, who's maybe the greatest Canadian writer. Munro won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2013. She's a short story writer. She's written many collections of stories. They're all fantastic. I'll probably just pick and choose different stories from different collections. If you're looking for specific recommendations, I'll put some in the description down below. But you can, any collection by Alice Munro is phenomenal. And she writes these stories, I think, about ordinary lives. She writes a lot about family dynamics, about marriages, about parents and children, about love, about divorce. And I was wrong about Alice Munro for a long time, because I think I understood her primarily as writing these incisive, psychologically realistic domestic dramas. She vividly describes what it's like to go through a divorce or to move from a small town to a big city. She has a deep understanding of human psychology. But just a couple of years ago, I was teaching her stories to another one of our great books classes, and my whole perspective changed. I realized the multiple levels that are at work within her stories, because she is doing all of that. She's writing these gripping stories about heartbreak and about family, but structurally, she's also a genius. One thing you notice when you start to pay attention is that she writes in a non-linear style most of the time. Her stories, they don't beginning, middle, and end. It's, middle, beginning, middle, end, back to the beginning, middle again. They move around through time. And thematically, the stuff she's often talking about, they're coming of age stories, or it's a story about memories. It's about regret, or it's about nostalgia. And so I began to understand that Munro is really writing about our human experience of living within time, of being like bound by history, like being historical beings. So these stories become these deep philosophical meditations on what it means to live within time. I guess that's how you win the Nobel Prize. And that's kind of the story of our first semester, this first year Great Books course I'm teaching at St. Thomas. How do you live as a human being in time with limitations? You're mortal. What do you do? And how can thinking and writing and reading help us navigate human life? If you want to do some reading and thinking, I made a whole other video over here about like reading classics for beginners. You can check that out. You might enjoy it. And if you like this video and you want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon page. Maybe I'll see you there, or I'll see you there. I'll talk to you soon.